Hello again. This is Tyler from Singapore Green New Deal. In this video, I'm going to talk about Singapore's climate change and environmental problem using the perspective of community organizing and the institutional analysis framework that was developed from the research of Elinor Ostrom on common pool resource situations. In the first part of the video, I'll present an overview of Elinor Ostrom's research work on solving collective action problems for a specific type of problem known as a common pool resource. I'll use the case study from the work of a Gal Oya irrigation system in Sri Lanka, which was one of the situations that was included as part of Elinor Ostrom's research. I'll then move on to present the problem of urban sustainability and the unique challenges for Singapore. I'll look into how Ostrom's framework for community organizing and the lessons learned on the role of institutions and trust for solving common pool resource situations could be applied for the unique systemic challenges on environmental sustainability in Singapore.
First, a recap of Singapore's carbon conundrum. One of the themes of why Singapore's climate change problem is known as the carbon conundrum is because both the effects of climate change and Singapore's contribution to the problem involve resources and interfaces that lie beyond Singapore's borders. We'll come back to that dilemma in the second part of the video. First, a summary of the carbon conundrum problem before we get into the community-based problem solving. The climate change problem globally can be considered as a collective action failure. We all share globally the same common resource, which is the atmosphere. And carbon emissions pollute that common resource, and over time, eventually, that makes it hazardous, and it makes us worse off for everybody. Each individual countries and multinational corporations all contribute to polluting that common atmosphere and creating that hazard, yet they are not acting effectively in a way that would mitigate or prevent that hazard from happening. So actions by the individuals is not in the interest of everybody, and everybody loses. It's not immediately obvious as to how these problems could be solved. For one of the main sources of where a lot of the activity that's being generated from all these emissions is in cities. And Singapore is a classic example. For Singapore, 95% of the electricity is generated from carbon-intensive sources, primarily natural gas without carbon capture. In terms of other emissions, not just territorial emissions, but all the emissions from the purchases from businesses as well as individual domestic consumption, Singapore is up in the 90th percentile with 30 tons per capita of emissions, total consumption-based emissions. Over 90% of Singapore's food is imported using natural capital that is outside Singapore's urban borders. Majority of the road vehicles in Singapore use petrol and diesel, which are very carbon intensive. Air travel is one of the largest non-essential sources of carbon emissions that pollutes a lot of carbon emissions per kilometer traveled and is not essential. A lot of it comes from business activities as well as the activities of personal lifestyle choices of individuals. And then one of the biggest sources of electricity consumption is air conditioning in Singapore, since it's a tropical climate. It's not immediately obvious as how these problems would be solved, since a lot of these activities is part of the routine activities of how businesses operate their business models, as well as the routines of everyday lifestyle. One way of approaching this conundrum is considered as a type of coordination or collective action problem that's occurring on many levels, both at the international level as well as subnational levels. Collective action problems on various scales are not new and have been on the subject of sociology and economics for quite some time. Around the world and throughout time are stories of communities that have had varying successes at coordination and cooperation and managing local resources and solving community problems cooperatively. This is a photo here of one of the enduring success stories of a self-organizing community-based solution in the Spanish huertas, an irrigation system that is governed and operated by the local community with little intervention from the regional Spanish government. This type of huertas also would not be accurate to characterize them as privatized or market-based solution.
In fact, there's a wide range of institutional alternatives to privatization or the state that have successfully managed to solve collective action challenges. One example of a collective action problem is the Gal Oya irrigation system in Sri Lanka in 1979.
In the late 1970s, a research group, ARTI, the Agrarian Research and Training Institute, was a concerned observer that had noticed that these rice fields, these farmers and the water resource was not being managed in a way that would give the highest yield and equitable distribution of water and therefore the yield of the rice to the farmers that depended on it. There were a few agents involved in this. One of them was the farmer community themselves. The other one was the local authorities, and then the third, uh, the agent in this entire story is that of the concerned observer, the academic ARTI organization. I'm going to summarize from you some excerpts from a report that was written about that collective action situation. The Oya irrigation system, located in the southeastern part of Sri Lanka, was the largest irrigation-based settlements project in the island prior to the Mahaweli development project. The construction of the irrigation system began in 1948 and was completed in the early 1950s. The reservoir, Samudraya, can store up to 770,000 acre-feet of water and has a command area of about 120,000 acres. The Gal Oya irrigation system has three main divisions: the left bank, the right bank, and the river division. The left bank commands area is the largest of the three divisions with about 65,000 acres of irrigated land. The system is comprised of nearly 32 miles of main channels, 50 miles of major distributaries, about 600 miles of field channels. The physical system of Gal Oya Left Bank, acronym GOLB, in the late 1970s was aptly described as hydrological nightmare. Channels were silted, structures were broken, and the channel rapacity had been greatly reduced by erosion. By 1978, the irrigation system of the GOLB was in very deteriorated condition. Main system management was haphazard, and in 1982, water was regularly controlled and measured only at 7 points for the entire left bank system. Because of water shortages, at least one-third of the left bank common area seldom or never got water in the Yala, or dry season. A survey carried out by the ARTI Institute in Gulb revealed that the average size of the lowland per settler was only 2 acres, with a distribution range of from half an acre to 5 acres, which indicated there was a skewed distribution of land ownership. This is a consequence of several interrelated factors, one of them being mortgaging, another is sharecropping, and extensive encroachments, especially in the upper reaches of the Gulb. In some places, as much as 40% of settlers were non-owner operated. Cooperation among farmers was minimal. Social relations among settlers who came from different areas of the country were often strained. Settlers generally had a low self-image. Relations between farmers and the local officials was marked by mistrust and recrimination. Farmers had no confidence in the competence of the trustworthiness of the local administrative staff. For example, a farmer asked the ATR research team in early 1980s whether it was possible to get an agency other than the local officials to implement the rehabilitation project. Many field level officials were notorious for their corruption and thuggery. The main obstacle to efficient water management from the farmer's point of view was the local level officials who had political and bureaucratic power behind them. On the other hand, the local officials, especially irrigation engineers, believed that the farmers could not use water responsibly and carefully. Therefore, they argued, it was necessary to organize, educate, and discipline the farmers to do whatever the local officials asked them to do. Thus, the farmers were considered part of the problem, whereas the local officials, were considered part of the solution. So now that we have an idea of a specific example, let's move on to define exactly what the features are that define a collective action problem. A community collective action problem, from the perspective of a third party concerned observer like you or I, is a situation where, number one, there is a collective action failure. that everyone in the community would be better off in a different configuration, but yet no single individual has the incentive to change or means to affect the outcome. The second condition is that there are many autonomous participants, meaning that they're they're somewhat free to act on their own and are not necessarily obliged or constrained by the actions of others or an authority. And the number of participants could be in the hundreds or in the thousands. The third condition is that there's no that you, as a concerned observer, do not have any formal decision authority or significant market power to directly influence the participants' behavior. So you have limited ability to influence as a concerned observer. It's these types of community collective action problems that were the focus for the research of a woman by the name of Elinor Ostrom. To introduce Ostrom's work and what she found on these collective action problems, and more interestingly, what the patterns of the solutions and failures were, I'll do that first by introducing a definition of a particular type of problem situation that she studied, which she referred to as a common pool resource situation. Next, I'll get into what she had found were the important features and conditions that separated the successful cases from the failure cases, the features, and then as well as the lessons learned. And then I'll introduce a little bit into the theoretical model that she had developed to explain and the dynamics of why and how successful collective action communities were effective for common pool resources. The name that she gave this theoretical analytical framework is the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework. And then next, I'll move on to the question of how a concerned observer, like the ATRI or you or I, could effectively organize a set of activities and resources that would be most instrumental to affecting change, positive change, and making the most likely successful outcomes for specific cases of communities and collective active failures that we are interested to 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 help improve. We'll come back to the Galoya Sri Lanka case study and look at the activities of the ATRI and look at what were the things that they did that were effective and the things and the challenges that they faced. And then, of course, collective action failures, of course, if they were easy, they'd be solved already. So we'll look into some of the challenges and risks associated with getting involved in collective action failures and how dealing with these risks is part of the how concerned observer organization would prioritize and develop a set of activities and methodologies and intervention methods to mitigate and deal with those risks. Ostrom limited her focus to a special class of problems she referred to as common pool resources. First, a little basic setup of the system, the basic elements in the system. The first is that there's a common pool resource, which is it could be an abstract resource, like a knowledge resource, but most of the time in the cases that Ostrom looked at in her research paper governing the commons from 1990, these are actual physical natural resources such as irrigation systems or fisheries. The second feature in a common pool resource system is the community, or what she called appropriators. And I'll refer to them interchangeably as other appropriators or community members. The appropriators, and we'll get to the features of the appropriators, but essentially they are people who have access to this resource. And it's not easy to exclude them from the resource, whether because they have some obligation to it or just that they're close enough to it that they can access it. And that composed this is the system. The first feature of a common pool resource situation is that there is some available extractable value from this resource. And that means a net value. That means after deducting out the cost of what it would take to do the extraction. And so that means that there's some value that's available either that could be taken by one of the appropriators or could be shared. So there's some value opportunity that's out there to be allocated in some way. The second feature is that the nature of that resource or benefit or value is a rival value or rival product. What that means is that when one appropriator uses or consumes that value, it's necessarily uh, is is less that's available for someone else to use. So um, examples of products that are non-rival is like this YouTube video, which is an information or knowledge source, which your consumption of it does not necessarily deprive or deplete from anyone else's ability to consume or use that same knowledge or resource. But things that exist in the physical world have this property of being finite, and therefore they consumption by one person necessarily depletes from another person's ability to use it. The next feature is that they're open access, meaning that anybody is able to access the resource. Particularly the appropriators have free and open access, and it is difficult to exclude the other appropriators from using the resource. The next feature is that the resource is sufficiently large that it is difficult but not impossible to identify users for exclusion or control the use of the resource. Ostrom's research aim was to identify governance models for sustainable use of a common pool resource that was an alternative to privatization or a Leviathan state authority. She organized her conclusions about which types of circumstances predicted a success or a failure into circumstance factors, features of the appropriators, and features of the institutional arrangements, the main conclusion of her research, the 8 principles for success. The first situational condition is the value opportunity, meaning that there is a collective awareness of a measurable and achievable collective value gain between the current state and a fully functioning state of the common pool resource. The second situational condition is that the, the common pool resource is observable, meaning that the state of the resource, its stock conditions, can be verified and assessed at a reasonably low cost. The third condition is that there's predictable rents. The future flow of the extractable rents from this resource can be predicted at reasonably low cost. The fourth condition is the boundary conditions, meaning that the common pool resource is sufficiently contained that the external boundaries and internal conditions can be determined by the appropriators at a reasonably low cost. Now, the other types of conditions that separate the successes from the failures is the conditions of the community, of the appropriators. The first point is that there's a common stake or pain point that exists within the community. The community understands that the sustained health of the CPR is vital to them, usually their economic or material existence in the case of farmers, that they have a vested stake in the outcomes of whether the CPR sails or feeds. Second feature is that they have a shared understanding of the CPR. It's how it works. The community shares a common image of how the resource operates and how their actions affect both each other and the health of the CPR resource. Third feature is a low discount rate, that the community values the streams of extractable rents and benefits from the CPR that are far into the future. The fourth feature is that there's trust and reciprocity among the community members, that there's healthy working relationships within the community, that they're able to communicate, that they trust one another to keep promises, and they relate to one another with reciprocity. The fifth feature is autonomy, that the community has the autonomy to set their own rules for access rights, harvest, and appropriate rents without prior approval or interference from an outside governing authority, which could be a parent company in the case of a multinational corporation, or it could be the local government officials. And finally, the sixth feature is that they possess some leadership or organizational skills within the community of people who have the minimal skills of to organize either by prior experience or by observing or studying other successful communities. One common denominator for Ostrom's theoretical model for what separates successes from failure can be summarized in one word: trust. This diagram is my own summary of how Ostrom describes the interacting dynamics for how the actions and institutional arrangements interact with one another, but important dynamics, and within that is the important dynamics of trust and cooperation, and how these features lead to the outcomes of the environment. When community members share a higher sense of trust, both in the, the rules of appropriation that govern the use of it, as well as the trust that others are going to follow those rules, and also trust that they understand and they have all the information that they need about how the system works and operates. It is this trust that is a prerequisite condition to enable them to make long-term decisions. And similar to that is the willingness for them to take risks more critically. Both long-term decision making and risks are both instrumental to the two things that lead to environmental sustainability, which is the both the direct environmental sustainability, which means investing directly in things that preserve natural capital, but also investing in the tools or technology that enable productivity, which means that less environmental resources need to be consumed to achieve the same set of services for well-being for the community. Another feature that's important uh, in in being able to deliver that technology is human capital. Human capital means the skills and knowledges, as well as the that people possess, so that they're able to execute and operate and contribute to the community effectively. And human capital requires investment, just as other forms of capital. Um, and it also requires some level of trust as well, um, because it's a human capital and education is a collective investment. Trust and cooperation feed back on one another. When there is more evidence that there's cooperation going on, that contributes to higher levels of trust. And consequently, vice versa, higher levels of trust lead to the willingness to take behaviors of cooperation. So the two of these are uh, intimately interconnected. Finally, the preconditions for that lead to or favor conditions where trust and cooperation can happen is when there's transparency, when people can see not only what others are doing and hold people accountable to that, especially leaders, but also they can see the transaction history of what people have been doing, how enforcement has been effective, as well as the stocks and flows and rents and benefits and costs of the use of the resource itself. So transparency is a critical prerequisite enabler for building trust. And related to that, as well as cooperation, is connectivity. That means that people are have the ability to either communicate or they're physically near one another, but there's an opportunity to connect and form relationships. So transparency and connectivity are the prerequisite foundational conditions that are necessary in order for the conditions for trust and cooperation to start and form. But trust and cooperation don't automatically happen. They build up over time. Similarly, connectivity and relationships build over time. And connectivity and relationships also build uh, along with prior experience of trust. So there is an interactive dynamics between all of these features within a successful community. Ostrom summarized her theory into 8 principles for success. The first principle is clearly defined boundaries. Effective exclusion for members and non-members Now, a contrast to the common pool resource situation, which is a closed system, is a fully open system, which would be considered a public good, which was not exactly what Ostrom studied. For her, the ability for the members to exclude the resource from outsiders was critical condition for success. The second condition was what she called congruence, which is that there was a rational relationship between the appropriation rules and the specifics or dynamics of the common pool resource and also the community. The third condition is that there was democratic decision making, meaning that all the members have the ability to influence the appropriation rules or collective choice arrangements. But the fourth condition is that the rules were enforced by monitoring, either by the appropriators themselves or by a delegate. The fifth condition is that there were graduated sanctions, meaning that penalties for violations for rules for first-time offenses were relatively minor, and they would only, maybe a warning, and they would only gradually escalate with repeated offenses. And a lot of the times, even the highest level of penalty was still quite moderate and restrained. Uh, Another condition is a conflict resolution mechanism that is available at low cost and easy access to all the members. And also that members can observe and monitor how other past conflict resolutions have occurred and whether they are ultimately succeeding or whether they're having any problems or not. The seventh condition is that there is an endorsement of the appropriation rules and the governance system uh, of limited authority by the higher authorities. So that these institutions that is created by this community is respected, and their autonomy to set their own rules is given some limited autonomy by the higher authorities. And something that's a little bit more complex is that larger systems are essentially uh, collections of nested, meaning that they contain other CPR or lower level, more simple government systems. So this is saying that larger systems can essentially be described as collections of smaller CPR or institutions that meet these features. The other contribution from Ostrom's research was a methodological tool that she used in her field study analysis that she refers to as an institutional analysis and development framework. And this framework is ultimately a mathematical framework that uses a combination of the game theory and other um, economics types of analysis. What's a critical prerequisite to being able to do institutional analysis is to have a model, which was mentioned earlier, of the common pool resource and its stocks and flows, as well as the the actions of and rights of exclusion and appropriation that are available to the appropriators. Because what happens in the institutional analysis is that there are two arenas where the analysis takes place, and this is actual mathematical calculations. The first is that there's a payoff calculation for which is here on this diagram as the outcomes, is a payoff of when there's the rents that are available from the resource that people consume or have some value of, and that value is calculated. Um, and then that is then essentially all of the actions that they take and the costs that it takes them to perform those actions, such as performing a harvest or doing monitoring for that matter. All of these are costs that are subtracted from that value. And by going through this analysis, um, the Ostrom or the person that's using this tool can start to identify when essentially the net benefit becomes negative. And this is what she was able to find. is that she was able to describe that there are two arenas um, where you could see that there essentially becomes a market failure, or there's no longer a net incentive. The first is in the action arena, and the other is in the constitutional arena. In the action arena, what to describe in mathematical terms what happens in a collective action failure is that the cost associated either with appropriating the resource or harvesting it, or in monitoring it and enforcing the monitoring, those costs start to exceed the marginal benefit of the resource itself. And so that's why when she described her points of situations where the conditions were favorable for a collective action agreement, at every single point in the time, there's always this phrase at reasonably low cost. So the low cost information, low cost of monitoring, low cost of enforcement, all of these are critical for the system to succeed because um, uh, then it's not subtracting away from the ultimate net value of the resource itself. The thing is, she also identified that there's something she called a second order problem. So all of these interactions, these relationships, the process of conflict resolution, the process of forming new relationships, maintaining those relationships, these are what she called the second order problem, which is that building consensus and negotiating consensus and coming up with new appropriation rules collectively and democratically is also a cost too. And that also needs to be deducted. So there's some constitutional cost as well at supplying the institution that also needs to be deducted from the net benefit as well too. So that's what she had. Uh, that's one of her contributions is this awareness of what she called the second order problem, which is the collective action failure of the leadership to commit the investment to come up with the solutions and tailor a lot of these what you call contextualized rules and appropriation rules that are specific and unique to that circumstance, and to sort of champion among the community to get buy-in and consensus, which takes time, takes investment, and so forth. So um, the another feature is that this uh, this analysis itself is also a knowledge resource that is part of the solution and a resource that's used by the community, because um, this in particular the interactions, because when there's a history of the enforcements and sanctions and who's violating, well, not necessarily who's violating, but the rate and the frequency of compliance, this is one of the critical factors, because when that information is available to everybody, all the appropriators, then they are more informed and they are able to do their own internal analysis as to the net benefit to continue to participate. If there's a really low conformance rate, many of them can just selectively choose to stop participating. And but yet, if it starts to improve again, then they may participate again. The thing is, just merely knowing that they have access to the information was, according to Ostrom, instrumental, so that they felt comfortable and willing to put the trust to be able to reciprocate and participate. Some of them were willing to go ahead and give it a risk as long as they knew that there was this monitoring and everybody could see what was going on. So transparency is a critical. That's that's how she was able to show the critical role of transparency. What this means is that this institutional analysis is a knowledge resource that the community uses to be able to build and develop the unique appropriation rules. And it's something that can be used by concerned observers, because concerned observers can do this analysis if they have the right information about the resource, and they know a minimal amount of information about the basic operations of what goes on. In the development of the collective action decisions, this is based on feedback, which means that this is potentially an adaptive system. So when payoffs change, when costs change, the collective action rules in the action arena, they can adjust. These are what you consider policies. Um, and but the actual the people involved um, are maybe different groups. So The operational team may be a smaller group who is actively involved in managing the common pool resource, whereas the entire community may only uh, have direct control and participation at the constitutional level. Constitutional decisions are things like um, who gets elected onto uh, the to be the leader of the operational team, these kinds of decisions. Um, so these are constitutional decisions, and constitutional decisions are more generic and don't specify as much operational detailed decisions as what is decided by the operational team. Um, the Constitution is also something that is uh, some ownership or stakeholder involvement with other stakeholders in the community, as well as really critically the government, and more and specifically the government's um, uh, uh, varying degrees of explicit, but the government's sanctioning of this constitution that was come up by the community, that they believe that it's valid. In other words, that if it continues to do as its terms and conditions has specified, the government will not interfere with the use of that resource or in contradiction to the rules that are set by that constitution. So the constitution is a bridge between the community and um, other stakeholders and jurisdictions. And the Constitution is also how the system is ultimately democratic, because this is how the individual members are able to directly influence the rules of appropriation. The IID is ultimately a knowledge resource. It's also intended as a tool for the outside observers to fill information gaps, and this is work that can be done that would directly contribute and instrumental to improving the success conditions. By understanding collective action problems for the framework as information and knowledge resource gaps, this creates a new opportunity for concerned observers to contribute to the problem-solving process without having formal authority or membership to directly influence the dynamics. One here is presented a hypothetical operational model for how a concerned observer organization could directly contribute to improving the situation for a common pool resource community. The two, as I mentioned earlier, this institutional analysis framework and the knowledge resources of how the domain knowledge expertise of how the particular common pool resource operates, et cetera, its technical definitions. Um, these are knowledge resources, which could be digital resources. Also, you could also include new technology or digital resources such as software as well. These are all things that could be resources that could be provided directly to the community that the community could directly benefit from. The activities that would be involved by this concerned observer or organization would be different types of research. The first level of research is defining the features of the system, secondary research. But once the concerned observer has some access to the dynamics of the community and some ability to communicate with the community and understand how they operate, what they currently are doing today in terms of the rules they're currently using, whether formal or informal, then um, that would be a primary research activity where they would be understanding the details of how the community works and operates, and also the situations and nuances and differences of the type of appropriators, and for example, the distribution of how there may be some differences and inequalities among them. Um, so that's primary research. Um, the the other activity, just as the ATRI example, is training and education. And ideally, the people should be recruited from the community members themselves. First, because they would have more domain expertise, but also because it's more likely they'd be able to establish trust and be effective in what's potentially sensitive or contentious discussions internally within the community. Um, and these would these institutional organizers who have been recruited and educated on community building skills, community organizing skills, as well as the technical domain knowledge, they would be actively part of the community and would be instrumental in facilitating, talking to, and building relationships with other members in the community, and helping the community themselves to come up with conflict resolution and coming up with new rules and institutions that are uniquely suited to the issues within the community. Ultimately, if the program would be successful, then at some point they would start with first informal organization. That means some teams or some local chapters or these kind of just small groups that meet regularly. And then eventually, once they've reached that stage regularly of cooperation, then going on to more formal institution and ultimately a constitution. Community organizing as a third-party concerned observer is a difficult task. And for real situations, it's important to moderate expectations and set realistic goals. For the case of the Galoya farmers, one such organization, the Agrarian Research Training Institute, ARTI, was in such a position as a concerned third-party observer. Here are some excerpts from their experience. Both the government and the U.S. aid had agreed to make maximum use of the rehabilitated irrigation system of the Gulb. It was necessary to develop better water management practices. To achieve this, it was imperative that the beneficiaries of the irrigation system, the farmers, be drawn in to look after and manage at least those sections of irrigation facility that directly serve them. Otherwise, it would not only be difficult to ensure the efficient use of available water, but also to prevent the gradual decay and ruin of the facilities themselves, as which happened during the pre-1979 era. Farmers' involvement in such activity was to come through farmer organizations. The main objective was the Farmer Organization Program, FOP, was to promote farmers' participation in water management, to include their identification of needs, and to be involved in the implementation, and also to include and to enjoy the benefits as well. The Institutional Organizers Recruitment Program was a program to recruit these institutional organizers. Several key criteria were emphasized in selecting the institutional organizers. The ARTI advertised calling applicants from graduates, both male and female, who possessed at least two of the following qualifications. 1. Knowledge of irrigated agriculture. 2. Willingness to live in remote villages for an extended period of time. 3. Leadership skills and organizational experience. More than 70% of the successful candidates were children of small farmers and had the background to help them win the confidence of the farmers to understand the problems quickly and to live and work under harsh conditions, both physical and mental. The IOs were trained for 4 to 7 weeks before they were fielded into gold. Their training consisted of lectures and discussions on the broad areas of agriculture, irrigation, local institution, and communication. The nature and extent of the training varied from batch to batch. The batches received more formal training and less field training, while others were exposed to more field training. The field training of the later batches was facilitated by the presence of experienced IOs from the field. More emphasis was placed during the field training on practical on-the-job training. This methodology promoting people's participation and working in partnership with farmers. The institutional organizers learn how to enter into the rural community and establish rapport with the farmers. Further, they learn how to identify farmers' needs and problems and how to resolve their problems. The most important component of this training was to learn how to work with farmers, officers, and how to promote healthy relationships between the two groups. A team approach was the basic strategy of development of the IOs. 4 to 5 IOs were assigned to an area within which individual assignments were made, but not exclusively. The group would meet weekly to discuss their work and problems, seek solutions by consensus, and become acquainted with the area. The IOs in the field were supervised by the research and training officers of the ARTI. A government officer from the district land officer from the Ministry of Land and Land Development was appointed on part-time basis as a resident of the IO supervisor in the goal. He was in charge of administrative and logistic problems of the IOs. The learning component of the FOP was initially done using a process monitoring program, using participant observation as its main tool. Process documenters, who were selected from the IOs, observed and reported the social dynamics generated as a result of the intervention of the IOs in the community. Process documentation attempted a continuous assessment of the process on farmer organization, their deficits, their strengths, their problems, and potential solutions. At the beginning, each program documenter discussed his report with the whole team during its weekly meetings. They identified problems and collectively devised strategy to cope with them. Quite often, problems were discussed and solutions were found in the field. The most significant feature of the IO trainee was that each of them was expected to enter the community with a trained but an open mind. He did not take with him a model organization. He didn't have a ready-made organizational structure complete with constitution, bylaws, or qualifications for membership, objectives, functions, sanctions for transgressions, etc. His objective was to initiate a process encompassing a range of options applicable to different locations and situations. So he's coming in with a toolbox. The first step towards organizing farmers was the IO's private meetings with farmers. This was done in farmers' paddy fields or at their homes. Through these informal meetings, the IOs and farmers developed a sense of friendship. In this way, the IOs managed to explain the participatory and egalitarian objective of the farmer organization to the latter. After the initial familiarization with the farmers, the IO met with groups of farmers who cultivated land use water from the same field channel to discuss the problems and needs. The focus of such meetings was to formulate strategies for solving problems, first with their own group initiative, and thereafter seeking outside assistance. Going up to the next step was to organize an ad hoc committee, or to choose a spokesperson to represent the group and direct group activities such as desilting a field, repairing a broken channel gate, or planning a rotation of water so that the tail enders would also receive their fair share of water. When the farmers got used to working together and realized that such group activities was beneficial to them, the IOs encouraged farmers to form a more visible farmer organization at the field channel level. These are not formal or legalistic organizations, but informal groups, and they function mostly through the offices of a representative chosen by consensus. Thus, one can see an evolution of community activity starting from a collective action towards a farmer organization. The ATI had continuously encouraged numerous problems in carrying out the FOP as an action research project. The IOs who were the catalyst were employed on contract with no assured prospect of a career. When the Ministry of Education began a large-scale recruitment of graduate school teachers, many trained IOs left the project to become teachers in government sector as it assured permanent employment. As a result, 41% of the IOs left the FOP within 6 months after their appointment. Thus, although 6 batches and a total of 169 IOs were recruited and trained between 1980 and 1985, the effective number of IOs in the field never exceeded 50 and averaged around 30. This prevented the ATR team from making an accurate assessment of the capacity of IOs to consolidate the field organizing activities in their respective areas. ATR planned to withdraw the IOs from the field at different times with a view to study how FCOs react to this and how farmers organize and sustain the activity by themselves without the IO support. For this purpose, the ATRA had a plan of action for fielding and withdrawing IOs. So the Galileo story illustrates that while there are some guidelines for success, there's also a number of risks and uncertainties. Central to Ostrom's theory, but also central to the challenges, is the different dimensions of trust. The first challenge of trust is the access, and that's the trust between the organizers or the concerned observers and the community. As highlighted, there was a intense amount of investment effort and strategy that was put into how exactly the institutional organizers would actually effectively get into the community, not just physically, but relationship-wise, being accepted by the community and being in a position to where they were in a position to where they could actually communicate with and talk with uh, farmers about problems they have, which is a very intimate detail, which requires a minimum level of trust. Second level of trust is the trust between the farmers in cooperation, which was initially one of the problems that was highlighted. And only by experience was that slowly, relationship by relationship, and through one conflict resolution after another, series of problem solved, was that uh, trust able to be built. But that's a risk, and it's not clear how long that process takes. The other risk is the risk of governing authority not ceding autonomy to these farmers or the proprietors to be able to set their own rules. It may be that government has strict laws already in place, um, and it may not be willing to change those laws or adapt those laws to the circumstance. So that is a situation where there is trust between the community and the local governing authority. Another risk is the information risk, the ability to identify a value and the pain points within the community. It could be that there isn't a value either, uh, or one that can be done uh, that justifies the costs of monitoring enforcement and supplying the institution and building these relationships. Um, so there, there's a risk that the value opportunity isn't there or that it's unobservable. Um, Another risk is the ability to create the awareness or the association. Um, in the case of the water management practices, this is something that was pretty well understood by most of the community, but it may not be the case that these things are easy to understand. For example, with climate change, it's not easy or intuitive for most people to grasp. There's a problem with the atmosphere, and we're contributed by our carbon emissions. This is very abstract and is only accessible maybe to a fraction of the population. It's getting better, but it's more difficult to understand than something like water resource in the irrigation system. The contribution of Ostrom and the practical lessons from and 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 also as the ATRI had discovered, there is a turnover challenge with being able to continuously supply resources um, to keep the concerned observer program running. From the contribution of Ostrom and the practical lessons from the ATRI, we now have a theoretical and operational framework guide for working with collective action problems that fit the situational description of a common pool resource. So could any of these lessons be applied to Singapore's carbon conundrum problem? To answer that question, I'll begin by repeating the features of the carbon conundrum problem and refresh our memory in terms of statistics. Next, after that, we'll go through a case study of a successful urban sustainability problem that was solved in South Korea on their food waste. After that, we'll get into the behavioral change and institutional dynamics within our urban sustainability problem. And then we'll move into getting into the translating the different contexts between the common pool resources that were studied by Ostrom and uh, the urban sustainability challenges through this perspective of the urban relationship, unique urban relationship with natural capital. We'll then move on into pain points in collective action problems as they relate to coming up with an urban sustainability model that may or may not fit with this collective action framework. And then we'll get into some specific examples for Singapore of some proposals that might be able to match this framework with specific proposals for collective action problems. The systemic shifts that need to occur for Singapore in order to close its carbon footprint gaps are first in the electricity and power generation, to move away from natural gas without CCS into lower carbon alternatives such as solar or natural gas with carbon capture or nuclear, etc. The second shift is the industrial value chain model, which is a bit abstract but important, to move from the linear value chain to the circular value chain. That essentially means in a circular value chain, there's a fixed stock of physical materials in the system. In a linear system, there's a continuous supply of new fresh raw materials that come from the natural capital. It's depleted, and then that gets converted into waste. That's the linear model. Um, in the circular model, you do still have that, but there's a higher level of it's a smaller throughput of materials going in and out, and there's a much larger recirculation and recycle flows in the system. The third shift is a consumption shift from material intensive to services. That's really two steps. One of them is moving beyond the model where the consumer is consuming material from as an ownership, so they own the material, moving towards their purchasing a service. The second shift is to then dematerialize those services, because it's still possible to have a service that is high material intensive. Um, but that first step of moving away from the ownership model and moving to more of a services model is a necessary shift, and it's complementary to the industrial value chain transition as well. Another shift is in road vehicles to reduce the reduction and conversion of the petrol and diesel based into the electric vehicles. Another shift is a travel modality, means like the mode by which we travel, from planes and cars where there's hardly any renewable energy or electrical substitute, to walking, cycle, and train, which either just use human energy or they can be powered by electricity. And then there's the transformation in the diets from animal-based protein into plant-based protein. One specific example of a successful systemic shift in an urban sustainability challenge is the story of South Korea's food waste problem. South Korea once recycled 2% of its food waste, and now it recycles 95%. These are some excerpts from an article that was written in 2019 about the highlights of that success story and some of the open challenges that still remain for South Korea. Globally, there's 1.3 billion tons of food waste per year, and that ranges between 300 and 800 grams per capita per day, with a larger component from consumers' losses in the developed urbanized regions. Initially in South Korea, there was a problem that the government recognized that food waste was excessive compared to other developed countries at the table of up to 350 grams per person per day, which many had attributed to the nature of the Korean cuisine tradition of banchan, which are these small dishes that are served together with the meal that are often not eaten at the end of the meal. And as far back as 2005, dumping food in landfills was banned. But starting from 2013, the government introduced compulsory food waste recycling use, specifically biodegradable bags. An average four-person family pays $6 a month for the bag, and a fee that helps encourage home composting. The bag charges also met 60% of the cost of running this scheme, which has increased the amount of the food waste recycled from 2% up to 95% today. The government has approved the use of recycled food waste as fertilizer, although some become animal feed. Technology has played a leading role in the success of the scheme. In the country's capital, Seoul, 6,000 automated bins equipped with scales and RFID, radio frequency identification. They weigh food as it's deposited, and they charge residents using the RFID card. The pay-as-you-go recycling machine have reduced waste in the city by 47,000 tons in 6 years, based on statistics from the city officials. Residents are urged to reduce the weight of the waste that they deposit by removing moisture first. Not only does this cut the charges that they pay, food waste is around 80% moisture, but it also saves the city $8.4 million in collection charges over the same period. Waste collected using the biodegradable bag scheme is squeezed at the processing plant to remove moisture, which is used to create biogas and bio-oil. dry waste is turned into fertilizer that is, in turn, helps to drive the country's urban farm movement, which is reported to be growing. The number of urban farms or community gardens in Seoul has increased sixfold in the past 7 years. They now total 170 hectares, roughly the size of 240 football fields. Most are sandwiched between apartment blocks or are one on top of schools and municipal buildings. One's even located in the basement of an apartment block. It's used to grow mushrooms. City government provides between 80 and 100% of the startup costs, as well as providing food. Proponents of the scheme say urban farms bring people together as a community in areas where residents are often isolated from one another. The city authorities are planning to install food waste composters to support urban farms, which comes back to the banchan. In the long term, some people argue South Koreans will need to change their eating habits if they're really going to make a dent in their food waste. So the lessons from South Korea's food waste problem raises a number of questions about ownership of the problem, catalysts, agents, and theories of change. It's not exactly obvious whether or not this is really an example of the community-based collective action model that was like the type of the one in the rural areas of Sri Lanka farmers, um, because it in this case it seems as though it was more of a leviathan or the state authority really driving and coming up and supplying the institution. Nevertheless, um, some of the lessons, such as transparency and the monitoring, such as this RFID, low cost enforcement, some of the principles we can still see were part of the solution as well. But then there are also these open questions as to whether there's really truly community buy-in or not, which means there may be limits without having a truly bottom-up approach. So some open questions. If you think about the Korean example, um, what are the real, and we try to apply that to Singapore, what are the real barriers to change? Ultimately, who is responsible? Where do we start? Where do we even begin? In the case of South Korea, it seems like the government started. The thing is, individuals could take the initiative. People could spontaneously, voluntarily, uh, become inspired, and they could switch their solar power providers voluntarily, but so far they haven't. Corporations could pay higher costs to operate with a lower environmental footprint, carbon emissions, but so far they haven't done enough. If neither individuals nor corporations, nor for that matter the government, is motivated to change to the level that's required to get these systemic changes done, it can seem as though we are at an impasse. The main lesson from Autumn's work on common pool resources is also relevant for explaining why change appears so hard for the carbon conundrum challenge. And it's because institutions guide our behavior and our decision. We think of ourselves as autonomous, free to choose, that our behavior is our choice. Um, but maybe a more realistic picture is that a lot of our daily life and habits, in fact, are somewhat constrained or guided by the institutions that we surround ourselves with in an urban environment. There are, we may not think of it, but we actually are involved in daily several overlapping institutions that guide our behavior and our decisions. Um, an institution is, according to Ostrom, it's a set of rules, and these rules can be um, formalized or they can be implicit and informal. Um, an example is just the fact that you choose to dress yourself every day. Um, uh, there's the institution of family that sets norms around, the roles of, parents, children. There's the institution of school that sets norms on, expectations for, what a person of a certain age should be doing on a regular basis. Um, there's religious institutions that may have rituals that may create a carbon footprint that may be materially intensive. Um, there are rituals around the behaviors around dating, which may create a market opportunity for material consumption of certain types of goods, such as alcohol. All of these are institutions that guide our behavior, and we're not, we don't necessarily understand how there's a collective choice in a model for influencing and gaining democratic control over these institutions. That's somewhat of a uh, open, uh, not very well understood problem. But that is part of the riddle of trying to answer this question of who is responsible, is that it's not quite individuals completely, because individuals really are a more accurate description is they're not totally volunteer, but they are actually confined by these institutions that are guiding their behavior, which consequentially does create this footprint. Um, and also, small businesses also are influenced by institutions. There are institutions such as standards that set limits on the types and kinds of, appliances or capital goods or types of supplies that businesses can buy. Further, the government structures of businesses set constraints on the kinds of decisions available to the managers and line workers, mainly if it's a corporation, a for-profit corporation. The constraint of having to return a profit to shareholders is a constraint. And there are a number of constraints set by these institutions that that reinforce the current status quo, such as the linear business model. So real change may be preconditioned on having the ability to influence and change these status quo institutions that that make up uh, that make up how an urban society functions and operates on a daily and weekly and annual basis. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, one of the challenges for applying the lessons of Ostrom's framework to the common pool resources for Singapore's carbon conundrum, it's not immediately obvious that the carbon conundrum meets the conditions for a common pool resource situation. For one, the urban relationship with natural capital is different than in the rural common pool resource situation. Mainly that in the rural common pool resource situation, the natural capital is contained within the boundaries of the community, but in the urban sustaining situation, the carbon conundrum situation, the natural capital is beyond the borders of the community. Now, there are other urban sustainability problems where the natural capital exists within the boundaries of the community. These are what I would call traditional environmental issues, such as air pollution and conservation and parks and things like that. This presentation is not for those kinds of urban sustainability problems. This carbon conundrum is a very special case where the natural capital that's primarily affected is outside the boundaries of the community. This presents new challenges, and it's not necessarily obvious whether or not the logic and findings of Ostrom's work can be directly applied in an urban sustainability challenge. A conservative conclusion to draw from the beyond borders distinction is that the first condition, the value opportunity in the shared pain points, it just may not hold. There may not be a direct association or shared awareness between the existential pain points in the community and the problems that are affecting the natural capital, which may appear to the community as distant or not salient. So in the rural communities that Ostrom studied, there's already a shared awareness or understanding of the association between the pain points in the community and the collective action. And that's different from the urban setting. In the urban setting, it may be that there's the need for a two-step process. First step is to associate the collective action problem with the community pain points to a common denominator. And so then that's where the framework of Ostrom's institutional analysis can then be introduced to then work on the common denominator and coming up with the solutions and supplying the institutions the solution uh, for this common denominator problem. Now, this is one way of resolving this problem of the fact there's not an intrinsic association of the community pain points with the collective action problem. A third alternative is the intervention by introducing new incentives such as carbon credits that would then make an explicit link between the climate change and or the natural capital that exists outside the borders and the internal pain points by creating a direct economic incentive. But these interventive measures may be outside the reach of a concerned observer. This is essentially something that may or may not happen depending on the actions of higher authorities. So as a concerned observer, in the beginning, you may or may not have access to the community to be able to observe or even have a shared awareness of what the community pain points even are. But what you can do to get started is to identify the collection active problems that are related to those communities that are also related to the systemic shifts that need to occur. So here's a short, not comprehensive list of a few examples of collection action proposals that are directly related to the systemic shifts that are required that were mentioned earlier. In almost all of these examples, in order for them to be successful, they would require higher level of participation, a strong network effect. So they are a type of coordination or collective action problem. Each of these solutions could also have the potential of providing a remedy to economic pain points, specifically creating local employment, um, but and potentially providing other value to the local community as well. So the first example is electricity source, switching to solar panel coverage. This potentially could be related to a pain point and an economic pain point because the common denominator is that it creates local employment. The process of going around and installing lots of panels everywhere is that creates employment, and particularly sort of medium skilled employment, which is uh, a non-technical skills that could be something that might be in short supply uh, in the current economic environment when there's a lot of disruptive change happening in the employment markets due to digitization, which is creating a kind of gap between low-paying service jobs and high-paying technical jobs. So having a sort of solar panel installation demand for that may be something that could be a benefit for the community. Similar logic, coverage for electric vehicle charging points may, using a similar logic, be another source of local employment as well too. Switching to from a subscription model to a service model, switching from an ownership model to a subscription model for durable goods can also potentially create new types of employment and a local ecosystem of repairs and um, small component part manufacturing to have a higher level of uh, circulation and maintenance of a fixed stock of durable goods, such as home appliances or other types of durable goods. The process of converting from a linear supply chain model to a circular model could ultimately be a more labor-intensive business model, which means that it could ultimately create more uh, again, the same types of sort of medium skills jobs, that is something that could be valuable for a downturn economic environment. Another opportunity is the Korean food waste model, and some of the community benefits could be the introduction of the urban farms. Um, Although in Singapore, maybe the limitation with urban farms is more of the access to land rather than the limitation of not having enough fertilizer. But nevertheless, this may potentially be another synergy opportunity where at least there's already a working model from South Korea to apply. So that means that the work has already been done to sort of quote unquote supply the institution because we have a working model to start with. Whereas in some of these others, there's the investment that would be required to supply the institution. Another example could be a community car sharing service. Now, this could um, have a potential pain point relevance if we talk about um, single families that have children and they, in fact, the car is not necessarily something that is, they really want to have, but they feel they have to have. And having to add that ownership of the car, the maintenance, the tires, as well as paying the COE, this may actually be putting the person in a worse off, or it may be something that is not enjoyable for their life, but they have to do it because they face a constraint. They're a single mom and a single dad, and they have multiple places to bring their kid, and that's the only way they can figure out how to do it. Um, but maybe if there's a community car sharing service, that would not only maybe potentially create employment for some of the people in the community as drivers, but it may also help to alleviate, some of the families that really are kind of constrained anyways and they need a little bit of help. So this could maybe be another type of a coordination problem or collective action failure that would also, if it were implemented and the result is that there's fewer cars on the road, that would also have some impact on the carbon conundrum. And then another example is relating to travel modality is a local tourism and using the same logic of creating employment and a similar logic to having a local subscription model for durable goods. More local tourism means fewer flights, more local employment. It's a win-win from everybody.
Thanks for watching the video. I hope you took away something valuable about urban sustainability challenge for Singapore and how the lessons from Elinor Ostrom's research on the role of institutions for solving collective action problems could be a useful guide for how concerned observers like volunteer organizations and NGOs could go about tackling systemic environmental challenges for Singapore. Problems that could have a solution that's ultimately bottom-up, community-led, in a situation where the current actions of governments and corporations is not quite enough to meet the need. If you like this video and you'd like to see more content from Singapore Green New Deal, do let us know by contacting us, either on social media or by dropping us an email. You can find the contact information and our website in the description of this video. Thanks again, and see you next time.